Thank you for joining us at our quarterly Corruption Prevention and Integrity Insights Forum. I'm Marlo Baragwanath, CEO at IBAC, and I'm pleased to be facilitating this event today. I firstly would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the lands that we are all meeting and broadcasting from. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people joining us at this forum today. It is fantastic that so many of you could join us for today's webinar. We received over 450 registrations representing agencies from across all parts of metropolitan and regional Victoria, and we welcome a large cohort from the various interstate agencies as well. And a special welcome to those of you joining us from our partner agencies within the Victorian integrity system, as well as our interstate counterparts. Today's forum is all about maintaining a culture of integrity under pressure. We know that delivery pressures are regularly present in state and local government, and these are heightened during a crisis. As we begin a new financial year, it's important to consider the corruption risks that arise when the pressure to deliver increases. And we need to recognise the tools and frameworks available to us so that we can best prepare for high pressure or crisis situations. It also helps for us all to understand what common integrity risks are associated with delivery pressures. Risk areas such as procurement, recruitment, grant assessment, and inadequate managerial accountability and oversight. We know how important it is that agencies regularly review their corruption prevention and detection strategies during times of crises to ensure strategies are effective in minimising misconduct and corruption risks, but also proportionate to the circumstances. We hope that today's forum offers you all some practical strategies to strengthen your existing systems, mitigate corruption risks, and maintain an integrity culture. And we're very lucky to be joined today by three speakers from the public sector and local government who will share with us their insights and strategies around this topic. In a short while, you will hear from Andrew Greaves, the Victorian Auditor General, Nicole Mccartney, Chief Aboriginal Health Advisor from the Victorian Department of Health, and Michael Chesworth, Director of Corporate and Shared Services from Murrindindi Shire Council. We appreciate the time you've all taken to be here with us today and very much look forward to your insights. There will be an opportunity to ask questions during an audience Q&A session in the second half of this webinar, so I will encourage you to submit any comments and questions you have throughout today's event by using the Q&A function, which you will see on the bottom of your screen. As this webinar is only 45 minutes, we will continue the conversation after the event by sending you any relevant resources and answering questions we're not able to get to today. And please note that we're not able to answer questions about any ongoing investigations or work. A recording of the forum will be made available on the IBAC website in the coming weeks, and we'll also share the presentation slides. If you'd like to turn live captions on, you can do so by clicking on closed captions in the meeting controls at the bottom of your desktop, or if you're using a mobile device, clicking on settings in the Zoom app, then tapping meeting to turn on the closed captions. If you experience any technical difficulties, please ensure you've downloaded the latest version of Zoom. We hope that you'll take away some useful insights and learnings from today's forum. Now I'm pleased to introduce our first presenter for today. Andrew Greaves is Victoria's Auditor General and has over 30 years of experience in public sector, external and internal auditing at the federal, state and local government levels. He was the Auditor General of Queensland from 2011 to 2016 and has held various roles at VAGO, including Assistant Auditor General, Performance Audit and Assistant Auditor General, Financial Audit. Andrew will be speaking to us today about the value of processes, drawing on the learnings from recent VAGO audits relating to this topic of maintaining integrity under pressure. Please welcome Victorian Auditor General Andrew Greaves.
Thanks very much, Marlo. And can I start also by paying my respects to all First Nations people who may be with us here today. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. I know it's a short, sharp session, so I'll get straight onto it and maybe we'll go to the next slide. I always like to give a bit of context, and the first context when we talk about maintaining integrity is to define integrity. And quite often people think of integrity as the absence of corruption, which is of course appropriate. But I also think we need to broaden that construct and then concept of integrity. And I maintain, and particularly because I'm at this left end of the spectrum, that integrity also encompasses making sure that what you do is efficient and effective and compliant with laws and regulations. So it's not simply enough simply to have an absence of corruption or malfeasance. But really what we're motivated to do as public servants is to make sure that we're spending money appropriately and wisely. So that's kind of a contextual setting. Now, on the next slide, we'll talk about, and I'm going to use as the backdrop for my talk, a report that we tabled in October last year, which is focused on the management of spending measures in response to COVID. Now, that was clearly a crisis in terms of a health crisis, but it also caused a huge amount of uplift in very urgent expenditure and necessary expenditure. And you can see on this slide the significant amount of money that was invested in COVID initiatives in themselves. And within that expenditure, I guess on the next slide, the use of critical incident procurement procedures and policies came to the fore. And this slide gives you a sense of how often the SIP policies have been actioned and initiated over time. And of course, in 1920, largely due to COVID, I think about 91% of departments' critical incident procurements in 1920 related to COVID, and the balance of it was the earlier bushfire expenditure. And this, of course, created an environment, I think, if you like, we talk about being under pressure, but it certainly increases risk around efficient and effective expenditure, no doubt. And it also creates an opportunity for people, should they wish to engage in fraud, both against the public sector and from within the public sector, and corrupt conduct. So at that time, more than any other time, I think it was important that organisations made sure that they were monitoring the expenditure that they were incurring under that kind of critical period. So if I just briefly touch on what the audit report found, and as I said, the report's available on the website. I commend it to you if you want to read through it in greater detail. You'll get some case studies and some ideas about how expenditure was sometimes mismanaged and how sometimes it was actually well managed. But the key points we found were that there were gaps in the critical incident procurement processes, and not just normal procurement, but the expenditure of grant monies. We found some gaps there, in particular around their fraud controls. But the point I'd make on this slide, and the point I'd make generally about this report and more broadly about maintaining a culture of integrity, is that the leadership context is everything. And what we found, if I want to generalise now, was missing in quite a number of circumstances was that leadership context. And two areas in particular. What I talk about, this comes to the tone at the top of an organisation. Whenever we're in crisis, you look up to your leaders and you want to give them to give you a steer, as to what is appropriate and what is inappropriate in the context of a crisis and needing to respond quickly. So its expression of the risk appetite becomes even more important. And, we've done a few audits in the past where we've looked at risk management, and this is an area that isn't very well developed in the public sector, the actual clear expression of what the risk appetite is. And therefore it becomes even more important when you're in a crisis situation, because people want to understand. I can remember making commentary at the time that there will be fraud and there will be waste when we're in a crisis. It's almost inevitable. But what people want to understand is, to what extent can that be tolerated, and how much should I do to try and prevent that from happening in the first place? Or should I subordinate preventing it from happening in the first place, but put something in place after the event where I can come back and try and detect the fraud, for example, if there was fraud? Or what can I do to then mitigate or ameliorate any waste that might have been caused through, taking swift action? So that leadership context, I think, was really important in terms of risk appetite being expressed. And of course, one clear way to express a risk appetite is to initiate the critical incident procurement policies. Now, what we found in a number of the agencies is that they didn't clearly communicate to their staff that they were activating the SIP policies and processes. And so again, a bit of a failure of leadership there. So staff were really operating in a bit of a vacuum. And it creates two problems, of course, because there'll be times when the SIP is quite appropriate and staff should be using the critical incident procurement processes, but without steer from the leadership of the organisation, they may not be aware of that. But there'll also be times when staff shouldn't be using the critical incidents processes, because these are for urgent expenditure, and there will be still routine expenditure to be undertaken. So I think it kind of sorry, I've just seen I haven't clicked the next slide forward. Sorry, I should have said move to the next slide when I was going through these findings. So it's kind of important that staff get that clear steer from the executive. If I go to the next slide, some of the areas we found particular weaknesses in, and I'll just draw to your attention, is this whole management of conflicts of interest. And, you know, we have three kinds of conflicts of interest. We have actual conflicts, they occur, we have potential, and we have perceived conflicts. When we're in a crisis, and particularly in a procurement context, where we're not using necessarily competitive market-based approaches, where we're maybe going sole supplier, you could argue even more so than at any other time, it's important to actually identify conflicts of interest. You know, it is more likely that it'll be more prevalent, that there'll be related party transactions, that you'll be leveraging off existing relationships that you have. And so really, people argue, you know, people say, is it bad to have a conflict of interest? And quite often the answer is it's not necessarily bad to have a conflict of interest. What's really bad is not declaring the conflict of interest up front, so that is identified and can be managed. So I guess we found too many cases where people weren't identifying conflicts of interest, and there's some examples there, but as I said, you can read the report. The other area which kind of follows on from that, and on the next slide touches on briefly, is the use of single quotes. Now, again, in a SIP context, in a critical incident procurement process, it's not necessarily a problem to use single quotes for procurements, but the red flag for me, and I remember talking to this about audit committee chairs, to audit committee chairs at the time, the red flag for me is that people can use, if you like, the crisis as a smokescreen, as a mask, to actually go and do some procurement which wasn't urgent, which really wasn't a part of the critical response, and basically circumvent the normal transactional and authorisational controls that exist over procurement. So again, here we found people, I guess, without really justifying why they did it, going to single procurements, and as I said, sometimes it really wasn't urgent expenditure. And there's a few examples there on the screen that once again you can read. And then I think on the next slide, record keeping. Yeah, okay. And I think it's tough, right? It's tough in a crisis situation when urgency is required to maintain documentation. But I think as some of the inquiries and some of my reports have highlighted in the past, the lack of documentation, certainly after the event, makes it very difficult to establish what happened, when it happened, who made the decision, and why the decision was made. And so, if anything, you know, I've spoken about conflicts of interest being declared as a part of your documentation. We need to still be mindful that we've got to maintain appropriate documentation, and if we can't maintain the documentation at the time of taking the decision or initiating the transaction or executing the transaction, as soon as possible after that, to then go and do the documentation. Okay, what else have I got? Right, okay. Now, instead of maybe focusing on the negative, we should focus on the positive, because we did find a lot of examples where departments and agencies actually exhibited very good practice and good process, and they didn't do what I just said in terms of using you know, single quotes, sole source. They did declare their conflicts of interest. But the points I'll make here, there's kind of 2 points that I think we should all keep in mind. We have what we call the lines of defence model. And the earlier slides I just spoke about really talked about the people at the front line, the first line of the organisation who are out there making the decisions, entering into the transactions, undertaking the procurements. And they are our first line of defence. They're there as long as they're well informed, as long as leadership's been clear to them about their expectations, as long as they understand the policies and procedures. as long as they're aware of things like, the state purchase contracts, then they will probably go and do the right thing most of the time, would be the expectation. But we have two lines of defence behind that front line. And we have like our central procurement units, and we have our finance areas. And we did see some good practice, for example, in some agencies where their central procurement units were monitoring and oversighting the expenditure that was being undertaken for COVID. So they were kind of keeping a check on the front line. And of course, the third line of defence that we talk about quite often is internal audit. And I think in the context of a critical incident, and when money is flying out the door literally, and people are making decisions rapidly, that it's also a case that internal audit could be in there with them as they're making the decisions or shortly after, and checking what's going on. So that would be the positive response to maintaining an integrity culture, is to think about, if I sum it up now, the leadership context, and then exploiting and using your three lines of defence in your model. I might leave it there because I think I've probably taken up my 5 minutes. Marlo, so I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I would have to say that spectrum, the graphic that you put up of the spectrum with integrity at one end and corruption on the other, really resonated with me, because I think the view at IBAC is to build a corruption-resistant culture starts with good leadership, good governance, and robust policy frameworks. So that very much resonated with me. So thank you for that, Andrew. We are seeing plenty of questions coming in, so please keep submitting them for our speakers, and we'll get to them after the next presentations. I would now like to introduce Nicole Mccartney, Chief Aboriginal Health Advisor at the Victorian Department of Health. Nicole is a Yorta Yorta woman from a long line of strong matriarchs and advocates for Aboriginal rights. Nicole has spearheaded the delivery of an Aboriginal health division at Victoria's Department of Health that is focused on embedding self-determination and cultural safety in the Victorian health system. Nicole will be talking about why Aboriginal self-determination matters when defining integrity. So please welcome Nicole Mccartney.
Great, thank you so much, and absolute privilege to be here today. Might go to the next slide. So I too would just like to acknowledge country wherever we find ourselves in this remote working environment, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people here with us today. Next slide, please. So maintaining integrity when under pressure is something that we all do, certainly across the public service, but very much so for me working in Aboriginal health. So when thinking about an approach to today's discussion, I decided that I'd speak about culture and integrity, and I guess really the intersection for those of us that work with First Nations people, especially where we rely on staff who hold connections to community, but also ask them to maintain an ethical rigour to their work. And when we think about a traditional understanding of integrity, our focus is rightly on clear processes, transparent decision-making and accountability. And absolutely that perspective will be more than aptly covered by other presenters today. So I'd like to share insights from an Aboriginal cultural perspective, and hopefully challenge you to think about integrity through a slightly different lens. Certainly integrity from an Aboriginal community perspective means being accountable to community for your decision making, and it means making decisions that reflect a holistic approach. For me, certainly I sort of consider myself through my relativity to others and through that connection, which is sometimes a bit of a challenging concept when we're in sort of that more mainstream construct, and particularly because Western culture tends to be premised on the individual over the communal. And certainly a communal approach means Aboriginal people have a unique understanding of integrity. We are in every action accountable to one another, and for those that work in government, we've certainly learnt how to navigate sitting in dual roles. I often joke that I think I might be one of the best placed people in this room to talk about a lived experience of navigating conflicts, particularly conflicts of interest, because I have to do this on a daily basis. And I'm convinced I have the largest file of declarations within the Department of Health, which means that I have to be comfortable discussing that within my organisation, with the leadership, with my peers, with my staff, with stakeholders. I have to be upfront about that and have a plan in place. So in Aboriginal health, our one certainty is that not everything will go to plan, and therefore to maintain integrity under pressure, we need to have already planned ahead as much as we possibly can. What will we do when we're challenged by dissenting views, timeframes, conflicts of interest, not only for ourselves, but our stakeholders? Or indeed, if we haven't got a integrity to the workplace, it really offers us, I think, a much richer understanding. If we could move to the next slide, please. So when thinking about a culture of integrity, we need to be thinking about that within the context of self-determination for Aboriginal people and communities. And certainly the government's policy around self-determination has been around for a few years now. But in essence, self-determination means Aboriginal people making decisions about things that affect them. And really, one of my key messages today is that self-determination doesn't just work for community, it achieves real and meaningful outcomes for all of us. And I think the pandemic was a pivot point and really one of the greatest success, for the Aboriginal community in terms of the response, because it was through Aboriginal-led decision-making that was really put at the centre of the government's response. And certainly throughout the pandemic, and particularly when things were absolutely chaotic, I think we chose to take what would be described as potentially a harder, more difficult route, because it really required us to change the way we listened to and was led by the leadership of the Aboriginal community controlled sector. And so it really forced us to work in ways that were increasingly far more transparent, I think, than we have ever been before, and by putting Aboriginal people at the heart of decision making. So Aboriginal leaders were certainly called upon to really form advisory and response groups. And in so was in many ways really assisted, I think, us to maintain a level of integrity. It's really difficult to be dishonest when you are needing to be so accountable and really building your decisions on evidence and engagement and that self-determination. So when I racked my brain for a specific example for today's discussion, I immediately thought about this example of how our government departments under immense and unprecedented pressure really prioritise doing things not necessarily in the most expedient way, even though we needed to work to really very tight timeframes, but definitely I think in what I've described as the most accountable way, leading to better outcomes. And I've done my best to keep things to 5 minutes, so I might leave it there for today and very much look forward to the discussion further. Thanks so much.
Thanks for that, Nicole. I really like that description of decisions that reflect our accountability to each other. And I would like to think that as public servants, we need to bear in mind the public interest more so than self-interest when we're making decisions that impact other people's lives. So I very much liked having that lens in relation to your role. So it's great. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker for today, Michael Chesworth, Director, Corporate and Shared Services, Murrindindi Shire Council. Michael has been with Murrindindi since 1997, when he was first appointed as Manager of Organisational Development. Since that time, he's held several senior executive roles and was heavily involved in the recovery and reconstruction efforts following the 2009 bushfires that devastated the municipality. So definitely a crisis situation, Michael. Michael will be speaking to us today about Murrindindi Shire Council's handling of recent crisis situations and the tools and strategies that have been implemented to maintain integrity under pressure. So please welcome Michael Chesworth.
Thanks very much, Marlo. And I'd also like to pay my respect to any First Nations people who are with us today. I have spoken on this topic before in an IBAC webinar, and I do apologise if I cover some territory that some of you may have already heard, but just to set the context, this is a little bit of a case study from a local government perspective. I'm with the Murrindindi Shire Council. We're a very small rural council, 145 EFT, about a $35 million operating budget. Our southern boundary, Kinglake Ranges, Marysville, we're about 60 k's northeast of Melbourne. Our journey for today's topic began in the period immediately following the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. We were the most heavily impacted municipality. 40% of the municipality was burnt. Tragically, we lost 1,400 homes and 95 lives were lost within the municipality, and a loss of a lot of public infrastructure. In the aftermath of the fires, during the rebuild, our workforce nearly doubled. We had many temporary, transient staff, project managers, recovery workers, contractors, community development workers, and so forth. Our corporate systems really struggled. We had poor induction. We had no EDMS. Everything was paper-based in those days. People brought their own systems, their own tools with them. There was poor integration back into the council's systems. And all that was happening while there was significant public and political pressure to respond and have the recovery efforts fast-tracked. Jettison ourselves 10 years forward to 2018, and the current CEO at the time was reviewing some older documents and came across evidence suggesting possible corrupt activity in procurement processes in the aftermath of the fires. Basically, an officer procuring goods from a company in which the officer held a controlling interest. Under the mandatory CEO reporting requirements, it was reported to IBAC, and Operation Lockout investigation was undertaken. And in summary, the main allegation was not substantiated, but IBAC did find that the employee failed to declare conflicts of interest when using their position to contract work to entities associated with a relative of the employee. Although our corporate and governance processes and business systems have naturally evolved and matured since the years 2010 and 11, nevertheless, the investigation in 2018 provided a number of recommendations that made us review and completely revamp our approach to integrity and governance. This led to some major changes. We had an organisational restructure in our corporate area where we separated our operational arms, operational and service delivery arms, from our governance, oversight and integrity arm. We developed a completely new fraud control and disclosure framework based around 4 pillars of disclosure, and some of this has been touched on earlier. So public interest disclosure, related party disclosures, gift and hospitality disclosures, and conflict of interest disclosures. And particularly the conflict of interest provisions being embedded within our revised procurement framework and also in our HR recruitment and screening processes, as was highlighted earlier. We embedded all of this in a new employee code of conduct that was based around organisational values that were defined through a staff engagement and consultation process. So staff defined values, and then we embedded the expectations and the standards that we expect into those definitions of those values. We've since incorporated all of that into our business continuity planning arrangements. Firstly, we combined the functions of planning for municipal emergencies, which has an external focus, with our planning for business continuity interruptions, which has a more internal focus, and that's all under the coordination of a single role. Our BCP also provides for oversight of all business recovery actions by a critical incident team, and that team consists actually of our entire executive and our leadership or our third level management team, and it's chaired by the CEO. Now, that might seem like an overkill for many of you, and some of your organizations are a lot larger than ours, but it works very well for us. It means that we can have appropriate oversight around all major operational and staff resourcing decisions. During a business interruption, it means that all of the leadership team and executive are across and can contribute to decision making. And we have been able to use this model quite successfully to manage the impacts of the recent COVID pandemic, where due to the luxury of more modern day technology and Teams and Zoom and so forth, the ability for that critical incident team to meet. Originally, we were meeting every morning during the early stages of the pandemic, just to review the external environments. What do we know? What are we required to conform with? What does that mean operationally? How do we allocate resources? And how do we then communicate that back to the organisation and to the community? So we've found that this approach and embedding the integrity reforms that we developed has really helped us with our approach to now operating under high pressured situations. Look, given the timing, I think that's probably sufficient background. I have presented before. I do have a slide pack that can be made available again. It was made available last time, but happy to leave it there.
Thank you for that, Michael. And I really like it's a significant body of work that you've managed to fairly neatly summarise in 5 minutes. So thank you for that. But I really like the emphasis on culture and staff engagement, and then embedding that in decision-making frameworks and BCP. So yeah, really interesting approach there. We've now come to the Q&A part of this forum, and thank you very much to those who've submitted a question with their registration. Please do continue to submit your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. We will try to answer as many questions as possible and keep our responses short. There will be questions that unfortunately we won't get to, so look out for our follow-up responses in the coming weeks. So on that note, and throwing to the first question, which might go to you, Michael. So generally, are you seeing the culture of integrity eroding or being enhanced in a hybrid working environment?
It's definitely a challenge. I have to say, I can't necessarily say it's enhanced. What I can say is that in the hybrid environments, it does actually at times facilitate an easier gathering, simply because the technology makes it available for people to attend remotely. So it hasn't removed the requirements that we've embedded in terms of our procurement processes, our recruitment process, HR processes. They're all driven by oversight and sign off at various elements, and those we found that they can still be managed reasonably successfully in the hybrid environment.
It has been an interesting time. I just find even staying in touch with staff and then being able to get access to you to get decisions made and all of those sorts of things, it makes it difficult when we're all still trying to maintain the same level of service and deliver it against the same expectations that we have when we weren't in a COVID environment. So it's been an interesting and challenging time, I think, for all of us. Andrew, moving on to you now, what are the red flags that we should be keeping an eye out for when we're working through those delivery pressures? You have talked a little bit about potentially getting internal audit involved and things that you can do to check afterwards whether or not there's been fraud, but what are the things that you could proactively look for that might give you an idea that something untoward is going on?
Thanks. Look, I've given a talk about this in the past as well, and I think I could give you a very, very long answer, which is that there's 5 elements of internal control that we look at as auditors, which start with what we talk about the control environment, which is all about control consciousness, about tone at the top, about leadership, and the first red flags. And I kind of alluded to it in my talk. The first red flag that I've seen in the past is either an absence of a voice from the leadership at all, or messaging which is along the lines of, well, we're a can-do, must-do organisation, let's just get on and do it. And of course, the signal that staff get from that is that, well, the ends will be justified. I don't really need to worry about the means. I think that's bad signalling. I think, as a governance of an organisation, yes, we need to look at the performance of the organisation. We need to get on and deliver, but we've also got to look at the conformance. And quite often, and this is where, people look at process and they say, well, process sometimes gets in the road, but well-designed processes are actually there. I mean, process is your friend here. Processes are there to actually deliver efficient and effective outcomes. These are the objectives of the internal control environment, that we have efficient and effective operations. So that's the first red flag for me, is I walk in and I'm not hearing anything from the executive, or I'm hearing some messaging which isn't nuanced, which doesn't balance performance and conformance. Below that, of course, Michael's alluded to it, you'll have an explosion of transactional volume and activity. I know one department said to me that in their grant program they had to stood up, that they had to stand up. I think it was something like 50 years worth of grant transactions, the equivalent thereof, compared to their previous baseline of grant processing. So this in and of itself, transactionally, is a red flag, because, as I said, it creates a lot of opportunities and allows people to kind of do things without being observed, right? And that's why I was kind of reinforcing the central importance of the second lines of defence and the third lines of defence in your organisation. So the red flag for me is that those second and third lines aren't operating. And that's something else I'd look at, where is my internal audit? And, am I getting resources sucked out of my internal audit when in fact I should be putting more resources into my internal audit in response to the crisis? I think I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, Andrew, that definitely sounds very familiar. I would have to say, whenever I hear of a part of an organisation that's resistant to internal audit, it makes me think to myself, right, that's where internal audit's going next. So, yeah, note to anyone that works with me, never be resistant to internal audit, because I like to know what's going on. Nicole, what are some practical ideas on how organisations can protect the well-being of those who try to maintain a culture of integrity? Because you talked about almost the 360-degree accountability mechanisms that are surrounding you, which sounds somewhat exhausting. So what are some of the mechanisms or practical ideas about how we can look after people who are trying to do the hard work of maintaining integrity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe it really does, I think, as Andrew mentioned, really starts with leadership in terms of those expectations, because it's not for individuals to carry that load themselves. It has to be really, really clear in terms of what those responsibilities are. It's also about making sure that people are appropriately knowledgeable around those obligations, and so sometimes it is really important to make sure that we are working to provide our staff with the right training so that they build that knowledge. And often when we are busy with those can-do attitudes and we're trying to get things done, training and upskilling of our staff sometimes seems to fall away, and so we have to have an ongoing commitment to that. But again, I think that kind of stems from leadership and those expectations. And then I think really trying to create a culture where people are able to raise concerns and issues, and that obviously doesn't necessarily happen overnight, but I think where people are trying to maintain that culture of integrity, I mean, the ability to be able to raise things without fear is really essential. And so I think they're just some initial kind of thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I would definitely second the thought that we have to make it safe for people to speak up, both having worked at WorkSafe and at IBAC, anything that we can do to make sure our people feel comfortable to speak up. Because in some ways, as Andrew talks about first, second and third line of defence, the staff are at ground zero. They're the ones that can sort of tell you what's going on. So I think that's really important. But also what you said about training and of staff, it reminds me of the first public sector organisation I'd worked in, never worked in the Victorian public sector before, walked in on my first day, got given the entire suite of policies, and by the end of the day, I had to sign off that I'd read them all and understood them. And it never ceases to amaze me that we still seem to do that without thinking about what work is actually required so that they understand the context they're now operating in and what it is to discharge some of those obligations that we have in the public service. So yeah, thank you for that. Now, I might ask each of you to answer this one in turn, perhaps starting with Andrew, but without sort of naming names or giving the game away. Can you give us some specific examples that you've experienced of integrity risks that arise when there are delivery pressures?
Oh, sure, actually, yeah, as you're right, without going into the fine-grained detail. No, but I alluded to it again in my talk, and I said, when we're in a crisis mode, it's almost inevitable there'll be fraud. Right? It's almost inevitable. The fraud triangle. We're talking here about opportunity. This is fertile ground for there being opportunity, and the examples I can give you that I'm aware of are actually fraud against the public sector. So the grant programs, and people will seek to exploit it. Now, sometimes people misunderstand their entitlement, and so that's not intentional. That's poor communication about what the actual entitlement is. But we quite often see people trying to exploit particularly these emergency payments, these early payments when we're in a crisis. Now, I've got a different perspective on that in one sense that while saying, it sounds a bit like I'm a fatalist, well, fraud's inevitable. Quite often what we need to do when we're trying to stand up a program quickly, and I'm sure the people who stood up the grant programs under COVID experienced this, is sometimes we need to have what I call a high trust front end. We need to build this thing and get the money out the door quickly because people need this money or they need that support. And we'll build a high trust front end. In other words, we'll trust the people to do the right thing. And I don't have a problem with that as long as, one, that's a deliberate design strategy that the leadership of the organisation have signed up to and are aware of the risks that are attendant upon that. But shortly thereafter, we do move from the high trust strategy to then going out and finding whether there was fraud, and so that's the next response. And Michael's given you an example of maybe 10 years later, looking at some fraudulent expenditure potentially, that, as he said, didn't hold up that way. But also then refining and improving the processes so we take the trust out of the front end once the emergency is over.
Okay.
So
thanks,
yeah, I
Andrew.
guess that's a simple example.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We are close to running out of time. So Nicole, anything to quickly add on that question of specific examples?
I think usually for us, we in limited timeframes, it's really tempting to go to the usual suspects. And so I think, how do we kind of make sure that we are following due process and really, as within our remit, trying to be as equitable as we possibly can. We certainly need to kind of hold ourselves to that and check in and remind. But yeah, it is very easy sometimes to try and take that path of least resistance, and we must absolutely kind of hold ourselves to following appropriate process.
Thanks, Nicole. And Michael, anything to add to that?
Just to add, one of the risks, particularly with respect to the COVID campaign, in an effort to record financial transactions that are additional to council's normal expenditure with respect to the, responding to the pandemic, creating a separate set of accounts to capture transactions relating to the pandemic, whilst very important from a financial reporting perspective, the issue around accountability and ensuring that those sorts of mechanisms are still monitored and controlled, and that was something that we recognised pretty quickly in the pandemic, ensuring that those cost centres that are over and above normal operations are still allocated in terms of accountability and monitoring. There's a risk for that to be exploited in an emergency situation, and then you lose control of the accountability around the expenditure processes.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and a big thank you again to Andrew, Nicole and Michael and all of the attendees and organisation for your contribution to today's forum. Before we wrap up, I'd like to mention that we will send you links to the resources mentioned throughout this session, as well as the slides and recordings of today's webinar, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. To keep updated on the latest publications and information from IBAC, you can subscribe to our e-newsletter Insights or visit our website. We also regularly share updates on social media via Twitter, LinkedIn and YouTube, so check those out as well. Finally, as this forum comes to an end and you exit the Zoom webinar, you will see a link to complete a short feedback survey to help us plan future events. We do take the feedback very seriously, and it would be very appreciated if you could provide us with your thoughts on today's forum. And we look forward to seeing you again at future IBAC events. Thanks and bye for now, everyone.